It's a trap!
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hi everybody, welcome back to the show. I guess it's about time for me to tackle one of the most referenced Bible verses, render unto Caesar. I'm sure everyone tuning in is completely aware of this phrase and its consistent appearance in arguments concerning Christians and the state. In most cases, it's thrown into a debate much like Romans 13. Kind of like a trump card. It's assumed that dropping this three-word phrase destroys any anarchist or libertarian Christian's pushback to issues concerning obeying the government and, more specifically, taxation. So it usually goes something like this. Person 1, taxation is theft. Person 2, render unto Caesar. Boom. That's it. Debate over. Go home. Never complain about taxation ever again. Well, that's how it normally goes, and what's expected by the person dropping the render unto Caesar bomb. Or maybe it's more like a mic drop. Something like, I bet you never thought of that. But all kidding aside, it is actually a legitimate discussion to be had, and anyone that is looking to understand what render unto Caesar means is actually walking into a very good opportunity to build our faith and our biblical knowledge, which really robs anyone of that opportunity to get into the Bible when we use a portion of a Bible verse to mic drop shut down conversations. And that goes for people on all sides of biblical debates. And I know I can be guilty of that too. What I mean is, and this still goes for everyone on both sides of a debate, how many biblical concepts are really open and shut cases with just 3 words. There's a ton of context behind these words, and just dropping them as if they easily explain your position is really doing a disservice to the whole discussion. So let's get into this context and see what we might be missing. I hope this episode is thought-provoking for both sides of this debate and the people in the middle that just have no idea what to think. Maybe you're a Christian and you already know that coercively extracting people's money at the threat of force is theft, or more specifically, extortion. And you honestly desire to understand and obey Christ. But you are only encountering this verse as that mic drop or bomb drop, and it shuts down the discussion. Well, this episode is for you too. And as we are working through the context of this, I want to point out that in my observations, there are primarily 3 different takes on render unto Caesar. I want to get into all of them and let you tell me after the episode which position you hold. The first view is the already mentioned statist position. I think I've already laid out what that looks like, but again, the idea is that because Jesus said the words render unto Caesar, that means we can't withhold our tax money or really even complain about it. Just shut your mouth, be a good Christian, and pay up. Usually this is associated with philosophical concepts of the social contract and how taxation is a use for social good or welfare, so it's obviously a good thing. I'm not going to get into all that today, and I'm just going to stick with what we should be taking away from the biblical text. We can square the more political concepts on another day, but all in all, I just want to make the point that there are political or philosophical beliefs wrapped up into it. Just like the other two positions that will usually affirm that taxation is theft, so there must be some additional concepts to the other interpretation of render unto Caesar, because everyone would agree that Jesus wouldn't endorse theft or stealing. So there must be something else that defines why this isn't stealing. Again, I don't want to get bogged down into making that case today, but just stick with the biblical text. And that brings us to our other two positions. I'm going to call number 2 the everything belongs to God position. And the third position will be called he's making a different point altogether. I'm sorry these titles are not as punchy as I'd like them to be. Maybe after the show we can come up with some better ones together. Anyways, at this point, it's time to get into the text. Yes, this is my favorite part. You hear me say this whenever we are going to look at a controversial verse, and it's no different now. We need to get a good idea of the context, and the best way is to just read the Bible. This really is the better place to start, and then we can get into the opinions and interpretations to compare them to what we read. So, grab a Bible if you'd like to read along, and here we go. So render unto Caesar can be found in 3 different gospel accounts. I will be using my ESV, but I don't think you'll find much difference in the language between any of the other versions. By virtue of being the first gospel in the Bible, we will start with Matthew, and then add in any additional details we might find from Mark and Luke's accounts. We find the render unto Caesar passage in Matthew chapter 22. Verses 15 through 22. And 15 starts, Then the Pharisees. Then. When then starts a sentence, it means there may be more leading up to this exchange that we are about to read. So let's start looking back until we know what happened leading up to this moment. As I start flipping back, we see more conversations between Jesus and the Pharisees. And really everything starting with the momentous event of Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, which means this conversation is taking place during what we call the Passion Week, which is the final week of Jesus' life, as he will be crucified in just a few days. When he first rides into Jerusalem, we see many people celebrating as they are acknowledging Jesus as the Messiah that they've read about their whole lives. The stories of Jesus' teachings and miracles over the last few years reached all over Israel, and here he was, in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was very significant, as it was the city of David and the home of the temple. And I need to sidestep a little because this is a really big deal, and the beginning of these discussions coming from Jesus and the Pharisees. The temple that we are going to read about in these accounts is actually the second temple that was built there. And it wasn't just a church or religious building. This temple is where God dwelt among his people. There was a large veil dividing the place where the priest could enter and the Holy of Holies where only the high priest could enter. This temple is where the sin offerings and ceremonies were made by the priest for God's people. All of this stuff is incredibly interesting as we see Jesus, the fulfillment of all these foreshadowing objects and ceremonies, showing up on this week that would finish a lot of these fulfillments. Jesus, who is referred to with prophetic significance as the Son of David and the cornerstone, enters the city of David, Jerusalem, which literally means foundation or place to lay a cornerstone, then enters the temple. He quickly drives out everyone buying and selling in the temple, then leaves to spend the night in the neighboring town of Bethany. Obviously, this isn't going to go over very well with the Pharisees, who are the religious leaders overseeing the temple and all obediences to God's laws. The next day, when Jesus returns to the temple, they begin questioning him and his actions. Of course, the priests and Pharisees think he is a false teacher and get really mad when Jesus starts answering their questions with parables that are not so subtle insults to them and show Jesus confirming that he is the fulfillment of Isaiah and the Psalms, stating that he is the messianic cornerstone that will be rejected. They wanted him arrested, but he had a pretty big following by this point, and they didn't want to stir anything up. So they decided to trap him in his own words.
It's a trap!
And that puts us back where we started, chapter 22, verse 15. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. And they sent the disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. Then he said to them, Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. So, there it is, the full exchange. There really isn't anything notably different from Mark's account, which is found in Mark chapter 12, verses 13 through 17. Luke has a couple extra details that are worth pointing out. His account is in the Gospel of Luke chapter 20, verses 20 through 26. In verse 20, he points out that their intention in the trap was, quote, to hand him over to the jurisdiction and authority of the governor. I think that this is an important detail as we start looking a little more into the implications of different answers Jesus could have given and the one he did give. And what would be a Bible study with me if we didn't take 100 side steps and visit multiple backstories? See, at this time, the Roman Empire was occupying Israel. This actually doesn't look much different from military occupations from other times in history. The Roman governor had full authority and control over the natives, and he allowed a certain amount of self-governance among these religious people. Herod was installed as the king, and the priests and Pharisees were allowed to conduct their religious work. A big part of these occupations are taxing the locals and rebellion, and the Jewish people were no different. This is where this trap comes in. Pretty much the one thing you couldn't do was defy Caesar, and everything else is pretty much allowed to operate as normal. It's definitely an easier way to control the populace. Most people will give in to various forms of oppression if they have a semblance of freedom and autonomy. But there were of course plenty of rebellious types that the Roman military would need to put down and lock up. We will meet Barabbas during Jesus' trials, and he is one of these rebels. So how was this a trap? And it was a pretty good trick because it was twofold. Half of the trap would be to possibly show Jesus as a rebel by him publicly denouncing taxation. He'd most assuredly be arrested and out of the hair of the religious leaders. The other half of the trap would be Jesus advocating for taxes, therefore losing the support of the people that had just been shouting Hosanna as he entered the city the day before. What kind of Messiah and King of the Jews would endorse Caesar's reign over God's people like the turncoat and puppet client King Herod? So we went over the full exchange. We got a little bit of historical background there. It definitely seems to have more going on than just the three-word response, render unto Caesar. Not only should we be wary of church or public policy being based off of one verse, but we should be especially concerned if it's only half of the sentence. So, where do we go from here? I mentioned at the beginning that there were these two positions other than the statist one. The next two are both held by Christian anarchists, but have some different implications in the way that we interpret this exchange. Let's start with what I called the everything belongs to God position. It's pretty straightforward and focuses on the last half of the sentence, which is essentially render unto God what is God's. This is a really good response because it drops a lot like the statist use of render unto Caesar and has some pretty awesome verses for its support. So it usually goes like this. Person 1, taxation is theft. Person 2, render unto Caesar. Person 1 again, and render unto God what is God's. What is God's? What isn't God's? The verses that are undisputed here are from all over the Bible, and most Christians can recall a couple offhand. Here's just a few. Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. Deuteronomy 10:14, behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth with all that is in it. Exodus 19:5, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. Psalm 50:10-12, for every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine. Job 41:11, who has first given to me, that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. As you can tell, these few verses thoroughly show that literally everything belongs to God. The implication from this argument is easily deduced, and it looks like a compelling argument to not have to pay taxes. The other position that I pointed out is what I called the he's making a different point altogether position. It doesn't have much of a mic drop appeal as the others, but I think you will find this very interesting if you haven't examined this line of thinking before. This argument hinges on the very overlooked question from Jesus. Prior to the instruction, render unto Caesar, he says, let me see a denarius, the currency that the taxes are paid in, and ask a very interesting question. Whose likeness and inscription is this? As we've said, Israel at the time was under Roman occupation, and the Roman denarius became a common currency, as well as the method used to pay the tax to Caesar. Very similar to modern coins, the denarius had a picture of Caesar and an inscription bearing the name of Caesar. During Jesus' time in Israel, Tiberius was the reigning Caesar from AD 14 to 37. So it's interesting to examine what Jesus was referring to on the coin. The Tiberius coin had a picture of Tiberius on one side, with the inscription Caesar Augustus Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus. On the other side was a picture of either the Roman goddess Pax or Tiberius' wife Livia, and the inscription High Priest. While it's possible that the coin was from an older minting with Tiberius' father Augustus Caesar, they would have followed the same design. I think there were some different things on the backside, but from what I've seen, they all carried the face of the current Caesar and his name. So what was Jesus getting at? He looks at the coin that is part of this tax in question, asks whose name and image it bears, then says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and God what is God's. So the idea behind all this is that Jesus is not only identifying who owns the coin by way of pointing out the name and the image it bears, but saying that something belongs to God by this same measure. And to Jews of that day and Christians today, the implications are clear. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27 are the first places we run into this concept that people are made in the image of God. Verse 26 says, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And verse 27 says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. There are more references to this throughout the Bible, but I think this is clear enough to show the reference to this image and the likeness that Jesus is referring to. If you'd like to hear more on the image of God, I'll have a link to episode 45 in the show notes. The inscription he is referring to has the same recognizable biblical reference as God's people taking on or bearing or being known by God's name is all over the Bible. Isaiah 43:7 states, "Everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made." In Numbers chapter 6, verses 22 through 27, God instructs Moses in teaching Aaron and his sons to bless Israel. After he concludes the blessing, in verse 27, he says, "So shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them." In Acts 9, God tells Ananias to go to Saul, who would later come to be known as Paul, and assist him. Ananias is obviously nervous as Saul has been openly persecuting the church, but God assures him in verse 15, "Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel." And some even use this concept to bring a deeper meaning to Exodus chapter 20, verse 7. "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." This verse is commonly known as the second or third commandment, depending on your denomination, but the idea of taking God's name in vain could also be the bearing of or taking on or inscribing on yourself God's name in vain, rather than just using it vainly or frivolously in your speech. In fact, along with some of the early church fathers, Martin Luther identified it this way in the Ten Commandments section of his large catechism. Section 54 and 55 reads, "But the greatest abuse occurs in spiritual matters, which pertain to the conscience, when false preachers rise up and offer their lying vanities as God's word. Behold, all this is decking oneself out with God's name, or making a pretty show, or claiming to be right, whether it occurred in gross, worldly business or in sublime, subtle matters of faith and doctrine." This is just scratching the surface of biblical accounts of bearing or taking on or wearing God's name, but I think you get the point of this position. So putting it all together, this position says that Jesus is saying we identify what is Caesar's when something bears his image and name, like the denarius, and we know what is God's. We know that we are God's people because we bear his image and name. So all that to say, the point of the render unto Caesar comment isn't about the tax at all, and Jesus was using that opportunity to remind God's people what was actually important and what we should be concerned with. We shouldn't be concerned with identifying how much of what we are giving to Caesar, but we should be concerned with identifying what is God's and are we giving to God what is God's, namely ourselves. Okay, I think that sums up both of the points that we came across today when confronting the statist version. You are generally going to find most anarchist or libertarian positions stated in a similar manner. There are a few others that might use this to rail against money completely, but I think that is pretty limited and easily shown to be beyond the point. If anything, we could make a critique against state-based or fiat currency, but it's not really about all currency. One point I like to make concerning that discussion is that money is simply a means of exchange. And although plenty of people try to make an anti-money argument with Scripture, I find this one to be a poor example. But as we enter the end of our review, let's visit a few quotes from some authors whose names come up regularly in our liberty and anti-state circles to see their positions concerning render unto Caesar. Tertullian says, "The image of Caesar which is on the coin is to be given to Caesar, and the image of God which is in man is to be given to God. Therefore, thou must indeed give thy money to Caesar, but thyself to God. For what will remain to God if all be given to Caesar?" David Lipscomb says in his book on civil government that there is no better explanation than Tertullian's, and that it teaches what the Savior taught: pay your tax, but you are not children or servants of the earthly governments. Give your personal service and your bodily powers to God. Jacques Ellul explains something of a mix between the two positions in his book Anarchy and Christianity, that the mark is the only way in which ownership could be recognized. Then he writes that paying the tax is without importance or significance, for all money belongs to Caesar, and if he wanted, he could simply confiscate it. But, he says, on the other hand, whatever does not bear Caesar's mark does not belong to him. It all belongs to God. In The Myth of a Christian Nation, Greg Boyd tells us that Jews were opposed to the image of Caesar because of its implied egoism and the violation of the commandment against graven images. He says further on that Jesus is being sarcastic as he points out that God's people shouldn't be fighting with each other over how much should be given back to Caesar, but the thing people should rather be concerned with is whether or not they are giving to God what bears his image and what therefore belongs wholly to him, namely their lives. In The Cost of Discipleship, Dietrich Bonhoeffer uses Matthew 22 and Romans 13 to help explain each other. He says, "It is immaterial whether the power be good or bad. What matters is that the Christian should overcome evil by good. The question of the payment of taxes to the emperor was point of temptation with the Jews. They pinned their hopes on the destruction of the Roman Empire, which would enable them to set up an independent dominion of their own. But for Jesus and his followers, there was no need to be agitated over this question. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, says Jesus." In A Christian Manifesto, Francis Schaeffer uses a long list of reformers disobeying the state to back up his position that the state is subject to God. He says that when Jesus mentions giving to Caesar what is Caesar's, that it is not God and Caesar on the same level, but that God is above Caesar. And when any office commands that which is contrary to the words of God, those who hold that office abrogate their authority, and they are not to be obeyed. In the essay Render unto Caesar by Lawrence Reed, he tells us to notice that everything depends on just what truly did belong to Caesar and what didn't, which is actually a rather powerful endorsement of property rights. Jesus said nothing like it belongs to Caesar if Caesar simply says it does, no matter how much he wants, how much he gets, or how he chooses to spend it. In the epilogue to Drosseson's Life and Death by Leo Tolstoy, he says, in reply to the cunning question as to whether the tribute is to be paid to Caesar, he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. That is, give to Caesar what belongs to him and is made by him, the coin, and to God give what is made by God, and is implanted in you, your soul, your conscience. Give this to no one but God, and so do not do for Caesar what is forbidden by God. And in The God of War, written in 1920, Baptist Reverend J.J. Taylor defines what is God's as every Christian is brought up with the price, and he belongs to God through Jesus Christ. Later, he reflects on World War I and the church's involvement across America, France, Russia, and Germany. He observes, generally in Europe, the church was bound up with the state, and when the state went to war, the church was necessarily in it. But in America, the case was different. The church boasted of its freedom from state control. It was bound by the word of Jesus to render unto Caesar the things that were Caesar's. But Caesar made no demand of it. Its participation in the bloody work of war was entirely voluntary. It left Jesus out of its war councils and deliberately rendered unto Caesar the things it had dedicated unto God. So that's it. What position do you hold? After hearing this and possibly learning of a new position, did you switch from one to the other? Do you have some punchier names for the two categories that I brought up? Don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes, or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episode on Facebook and the other social media sites. You can support the show with a monthly donation through Patreon. Visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page where you'll find a few ways you can support us. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe? This power is illusion, the need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.
God said there's a season for every single thing.
It's a trap!